before we get started. Any particular questions or issues so far? Yes?
Sorry, I just had a quick question.
Oh, that's okay.
I thought the learning suite said 11:59, like at the end of the day, instead of 1:59.
Oh, you mean for today?
And then I was just told to
No, it's just before class. Drop an email to Ty.
Okay.
Tell him I said it's okay.
Okay.
He can extend it for you. Any other questions or issues? I'm actually curious.
What was due today?
Readings were due as of today.
Oh, okay.
Just before class.
Oh, like the ones that were supposed to be due Saturday, but got.
They're actually as long as you mark them off, you have until 1:59 on Mondays to mark off. Yes.
So far, I felt like the reading, podcast, everything, the schedule has been kind of heavy, especially because we haven't actually started working on anything. Projects. Is it going to be about the same for the rest of the semester?
No, it'll start to taper down.
Okay.
It's front loaded for exactly that reason, because you're not really doing much with the project for about the first 3 to 4 weeks. It will taper down. I will warn you, there's a week where I think basically the second half of peopleware is scheduled. But again, if you look at peopleware, it's kind of like, it's very breezy stuff. It's casual light reading. You of course are welcome to read ahead. And then it'll taper down, and basically most of your reading, what I'm trying to do is get all your reading in before the midterm. And actually slip the midterm a week so the reading schedule wouldn't be too difficult. And there's only a little bit of reading once you've done the midterm. So yeah, it's a little front loaded. But hey, there you go. Other questions? Gosh, you guys are good. Yes?
The deliverable for the wiki was just the standard one-page thing. With
The deliverable for the week was each group was supposed to have your wiki up. And if your group had your wiki up, then bam, you passed. Yes?
I noticed that on Learning Suite you have like the deliverables
Uh-huh.
as part of our grades, but we can't submit anything there. Did the TAs just go through and check those off for us?
Yeah, I think the TA, for the deliverables, the TA actually is the one who grades them.
Okay. So,
Yes?
So for example, our repository is private, but I sent an invitation to the TA.
Okay.
Is that fine?
That's fine, but I want your repository for all your deliverables. Your code can be private. Your deliverables have to be public because I have to be able to see it.
Okay.
So that's why we have GitHub. That's why you have set up the wiki pages on GitHub and so on. Because what we'll do, for example, next week, I'm going to bring up each of your organization charts in class up here on the screen, so I have to be able to access it and demonstrate that.
If we added you to the private repo, would that be?
Huh?
If we added you to the private repo, would that be?
If you do, and submit whatever I need to know to actually get it and access it. As long as I can access it, but you have to make sure Ty can access it too, because he's got to grade it. So, other questions? Yes?
I noticed in the readings, it's Webster 1.
Yeah.
You were talking about good software engineers just have talent. How do we know if we're talented?
That's a good question. We're actually going to talk about that. Part of the lecture today is on those readings. Yes?
Should I change my major? I'm not talented.
See, as I see, if you read the Tepes article, I said it's not a single talent, and it's more a 3d6 roll than a yes or no. You have it or you don't. Case in point, I was in choir for 2.5 years in high school. Worked really hard. Actually was a decent singer. In fact, my freshman year here, first semester took opera workshop and enjoyed that thoroughly. But first semester also signed up for music theory for non-music majors and dropped it after 2 weeks because none of it was sticking. I was thinking, you know, it's kind of like, I look at this stuff and it's just like, why do you care about parallel fifths? The short answer is that if you really weren't good, and let me put it this way, if you really did not have innate skill and ability in programming, you would not be seniors in computer science programs. What you're going to find when you get out in industry is that you have vast numbers of IT workers who have never been through that self-screening process. And they're great ones. One of the best, absolute best software architects and programmers I ever worked with was a 23-year-old kid who had a GED who was absolutely brilliant. Likewise, I've worked with other engineers who weren't, you know, necessarily top-end talent, but who knew their stuff, knew how to work, delivered things. But I also, I mean, right off the bat, first job, in fact, almost my first project at General Dynamics, which is my first job after
College.
graduating from BYU. I had some code that I was supposed to work with that one of my fellow workers had, someone who was already there had written, and it was Fortran, and it was about 100 lines long, and it was almost indecipherable. And yet this was production code for a defense project, production internal code for a defense project, for cruise missile simulation at General Dynamics. And I basically had to make it work. That's something you'll find yourself doing a fair amount as you get out there, is making existing code work. So, but we will get into that. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say, so do you believe that good programmers are born, not made? Because I guess I feel like, you know, the examples of people...
I talk about 5 aspects in Tempest. If you haven't read that, which you should have by today.
Yeah, I read it.
Okay. Talent is one of 5 aspects.
But it was the most important.
It is. It's my experience. Again, in the Real Software Crisis article, I quote Gordon Stokes, who was my faculty advisor when I was an undergrad. And then when I came back here and taught 8 years after graduation, he was still on the faculty. And during that time, if you look at CS undergrad enrollment, you will find 2 peaks. We're starting to approach a third. There's one in 1985, there's one in 2000. One in 1985 was, frankly, the first tech bubble. Everyone thought that, I mean, quite literally, people thought, I'm going to go into computer science and I'll be the next Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or whatever. And then the 2000 one was pretty much driven by the dot-com boom and subsequent bust. But if you look at it peaks in 1985 and then it drops almost back to where it was before. And then it peaks again in 2000 and then it drops again. When I came here, when I was an undergrad, we had about 120, let's see, we'll just change the order of presentations here. Since you're all asking about this one.
Yeah, we're just trying to resolve like our
I know. It's like,
offended.
don't feel insecure. Trust me.
Too
Why did
late.
you teach us this 142?
Well, you know, I'll talk about that in a second, actually.
Oh, actually, on that note, are we like headed into like another software bubble that we should all know about?
There is a tech bubble going on. There are far too many unicorns, far too million startups with billion-dollar valuations.
Okay.
And it's without clearly I mean, you look at some of the giants right now, like Facebook and Twitter, and the question is, what's their business model 5 years down the road, just find their current evaluation? It's hard to come up with one.
Okay.
So let's talk about the first one, Real Software Crisis. I wrote this in '96. When I was an undergrad here at BYU, when I graduated in 1978, there were about 120 students in the computer science program. Went off, worked at General Dynamics, worked at NASA, worked at Lunar Planetary Institute, worked at Monitor Labs, did a software startup, did a computer game, started writing for Byte Magazine, and moved back to Utah in 1985. And when the department found I'd moved back, pretty much all the professors who I'd had were all still here. And they reached out to me and said, hey, would you like to come teach? We'd love to have you teach. You know, I've got a bachelor's degree. I'm like, yeah, that'd be cool. Well, I discovered the reason why I wanted to teach is they had 1,000 students. Enrollment had grown 8-fold in 8 years. You had to actually complete 142 and apply and be accepted into the computer science program in order to declare computer science as your major. My first semester, I taught 3 sections of 142 with a total of 700 students.
Wow.
250 in 2 classes and 200 in another class. And while I was in the middle of doing all this teaching, I happened to be talking one day with Gordon Stokes. So I mentioned Dr. Stokes was my faculty advisor when I was an undergrad. And he made a very interesting observation, which I mentioned in the Real Software Crisis article. He says, you know, he says, we've grown 8-fold since you were here. He says, as far as I can tell, the number of really talented students is the same. He said, not the same percentage, the same absolute number. He said, we were getting, before, when we were just down to 120, we were getting all the people who had natural aptitude thinking and so on, but now we're getting students who, like I said, think this is the next law or medicine as a degree, and they're coming in, and I don't know what the attrition rate was between entry level and graduation, but that was the observation. Now, when I taught, the other thing, and that I mentioned in that article, is when I was an undergrad, I took CS 404, taught by Tad Norman, and I'm trying to remember the name of the visiting professor who, like me, was someone who had worked in industry for many years and was taking a year off to teach. And coming from the industry perspective, he said, here's my observation. If you knew which ones to pick, you could take half of all people currently working in data processing and shoot them. And not only would no deadlines be missed, many would be advanced.
That's kind of terrifying.
It is, and I thought, that's just bizarre. And then I got out in the real world and said, and it's true. There are a lot, because, and the point I make in this article, the demand for IT workers vastly outstrips the number of people with talent, inclination, aptitude, and so on. And so you get, it's this giant sucking of people into the industry. Now, part of the consequence of that is that, and I'll tell you this up front, HR groups are not, or HR departments are not always very good at screening out good programmers versus poor programmers. They'll put up, there's a famous story from around '98 about a corporation that put out an ad for Java programmers with 5 years of Java experience. Java had only been out for like 3 years. So there's, this is why, and I'll tell you up front, this is why networking is so important. You want to bypass HR. HR, some groups are very good at picking the right people. A lot of groups are not. Now, I'll state what I said again. I've said this to all my classes, because they've all had the same concerns you guys just expressed. If you made it to your senior year at BYU in computer science, you're doing fine. If you like IT and you want to work IT, you will find good, solid work for the rest of your life, and you will likely outperform a substantial percentage of your peers out there. But just be aware that you are going to get out in the real world and find yourself working with IT engineers who really aren't good. Let me ask, for all those who've had internships and or have current jobs, what have been your experiences? Have you observed people working, programmers working, who perhaps really shouldn't have been there? Yes?
I was going to say, one of my jobs, I had a mentor who was supposed to be like training and help me, but I like knew way more than he did, and it was really frustrating to try and work with him because he didn't understand so much.
Yep. Listen.
There were a couple examples of someone using C++ code who's obviously incredibly used to Java, using Lua everywhere where it shouldn't be and such. And the interesting thing was I was assigned to do like first level technical interviews for a few people, and a good 80% of the applicants couldn't do what is it, FizzBuzz.
Oh no.
I'm not familiar with FizzBuzz.
FizzBuzz is print the numbers from 1 to 100, but if it's divisible by 3, print Fizz. If it's divisible by 5, print Buzz. And if it's divisible by both, print FizzBuzz.
And they couldn't write,
Just that.
They couldn't write code to do that.
About 80% of the applicants.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel better about
Now,
myself
this is what I'm talking about.
now. Tell me more about like what an idiot looks like, so I can make sure it's not me, please.
No,
That's all I need.
Again, trust me. I say this in all sincerity. You're here in your senior year. You would have changed majors by now. You would have. And you will walk out of here with a far better grasp of fundamental issues and principles in computer science than a lot of your peers. And particularly by passing this class, you will have, as I said, and I say this in all sincerity, 40 years of, being out there, and especially 20 years of reviewing failing software projects. If you folks do your reading, you will come out of here knowing more about how IT projects fail than 90% of the people we work with. You really will. Which is great self-protection for a number of reasons. I think there are hands back there. Yeah.
So I just wanted to testify on the talent aspect of it, like even though
Yep.
that throws a lot of people off.
Yep.
Like some of the best engineers that I worked under, like I've worked in church for about 10 years, 20 years, these are chief data architects, or they're at the architect level, and they're at the highest technical level they could be in the organization. One of them was an electrical engineer, the other one had 2 years of mechanical engineering, and the third one was a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
None of them did software as their core principle, and they're still there. We were looking to backfill my position when I was planning on leaving, and we were interviewing like crazy. And there were people who were coming out of college with IT degrees, and we were like for example, can you write a FizzBuzz? Do you know what a simple sort is? Do you know what a bubble sort is? And nope.
Do you guys all know what a simple sort is? Know what a bubble sort is?
Like insertions.
Or given
I know.
given the idea of a bubble sort, could you write a pseudocode for it?
Yep.
They're like, give me a day and I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Let me
Yeah, give me
Google
a day,
it.
I'll find someone else to replace you.
Well, that does get back to the issue that I mentioned with Peter Lenz, who was this. I would not have hired him based on his resume, but one of the programmers, software engineers I had hired, this was at Pages,
See the guy with GED? Peter.
said there's this kid back in Arizona, says all he's got is a GED, says he's writing his own object-oriented operating system.
What?
This is like in 1990, 91. And we brought him in and interviewed him and hired him, and that was the single best, at Pages, that was the single best group of software engineers I ever worked with. My last year there, I had to sort of step down from active chief architect job because I was traveling with the CEO because we were trying to raise a second round of funding and other things. It was Peter that I turned over the architect roles. He understood my architecture better than anyone else on the team, and he improved on it. He'd come back and say, we should do this. It's like, my gosh, you're right, we should do that. He was more talented than I was, pure and simple. And the problem is talent isn't always a guarantee, because talent often leads to prima donnaism, which is why I have professionalism down here. All things being equal, education benefits you more than not having education. If you know, the more you know about the fundamentals of computer science, the more applications you will see. Again, I saw that right off the bat at General Dynamics. At General Dynamics, this was down in San Diego, and they had 10,000 engineers working, and then they had this small pool of software engineers, and basically would be contracted out. An engineer would show up and say, I need someone 20 hours a week to work on this particular project, and Tom Reed, my boss, would say, okay, Webster, you're on that. Here's the charge number for your time card. So I worked on about 4 or 5 different projects during my year there, including a couple simultaneously. And a fair amount of what I did was go through and clean up other people's code or apply things that I knew, and do so very quickly. Professionalism. I have deep concerns about the cult that has grown up in Silicon Valley over the past, really been the past 20 years of the, you know, we'll do massages at your desk, you know, you'll have Agwala juices in your bars and everything else. I'm actually a firm believer in providing things to keep the engineers focused. I'll tell you about that as well. But it's carried to excesses in many places, and what you often get are prima donna programmers. At Pages, when I was hiring, I interviewed two guys who'd been over at Silicon Valley Software, another software company there in San Diego. And they wanted to come in a package deal, and they wanted signing bonuses and company cars. And I laughed. It's kind of like, you know, we're running on the founder's money right now. No, this is not going to happen. I had another job. Years later, I was in the process of interviewing for jobs, and interviewed at Rogue Wave. Any familiar with Rogue Wave?
No.
How the Mighty Are Fallen. They were sort of the premier C, C++ library back in the mid-90s. And their key programmer there was a relatively young man who was very brilliant and talented. But it became very clear, because I went through the usual interviewing with half a dozen people. And it became very clear as I got along, a lot of the other people there said he pretty much holds the whole company hostage. He's their golden boy. They can't afford to lose him. You know, he insists on running things. He makes demands and so on and so forth. And I had a final interview that was sort of a group interview with him, and I was asked, well, what do you think is the most important quality in a professional software engineer? I said, professionalism. I said, getting your work done, not being a prima donna, not holding people hostage. I said so knowing full well that meant they would never offer me a job, but I had no intention of accepting an offer if they made one. Experience. Our most painful experiences are usually our most informative. I think I've already mentioned that Pages was a full year late in shipping. And that set my whole career on this path as to why projects succeed and fail. Because frankly, all my projects before then had been successful and more or less on time. And here was this big venture-funded desktop publishing, and we kept slipping, and we kept slipping, and we kept slipping. And I kept trying to figure out, what did we do wrong? What did I do wrong? And it turned me from a bubbly optimist into a curmudgeon. Last are actual specific skills, which when we were doing Pages, we ended up targeting for Next Step, the operating system, Next Computer. So then Objective-C was programming language, still one of my favorite programming languages. Pretty much, except for one programmer I hired, Bruce Henderson, no one else that I ended up hiring had any prior Objective-C experience or any prior Next Step development experience. But they were all very bright, very solid software engineers, and they picked it up very quickly. And you're all quite productive. On the other hand, there are times when you need and want that skill, particularly in a time-critical mission project. In this was a startup. This was a long-term project. We knew this was going to take at least a couple of years. That was fine. On the other hand, you know, if you've got a project you have to have out in 3 months using React, don't hire me. Never used React in my life, and I would be spending, you know, time coming up to speed on it. I'd spend time making all the mistakes that someone who's learning to become a React coder makes, so on and so forth. So that's why I have, just a second. That's why I have these 5 items. And again, with talent, as I say in the article, there are a number of different talents. Architecture, coding, debugging. Probably debugging is one of my best talents. I'm a decent coder, and I'm actually a pretty decent architect. But I was the bug killer at Pages. You know, we had a code base of 300,000 or 400,000 lines. And because I knew the architecture inside and out, when bugs would appear, I'd be the one who could just drive down and figure out what to do and box it in and get down to the point and kill it. Listen.
I was just gonna say, I've seen the whole skills focus taken a little too far sometimes. Where
Oh, yeah.
They're asking for
Which
10 years.
certifications do you have? And yeah, don't.
Or my favorite is 10 years of experience in a technology that's existed for like 4 years.
Yeah, no, that happens all the time.
With that then, Obviously, if no one's going to hire you unless you have skills, but you don't get skills unless you're working.
There you go.
How do you get skills?
You find someone who's willing to hire you and then move you over to that technology, or you spend time it on your own. It's a challenge. It's always a challenge. I've actually had more of the opposite, which is I get hired and they throw me into something that it's an operating system and a language that I've never used before. So I'm working desperately to come up to speed on those while I am trying to get the work done.
You might have mentioned this in the article, but is this the order do you rank these attributes on?
Roughly.
So talent trumps education, which trumps professionalism.
Talent can trump education. Much as with Peter, he was so massively talented. He's still probably one of the single best coders I've ever known personally in my life. There's a few other, Edward Young, who was at Microsoft for a while, Anders Heilsberg, who I knew at Borland, who did the Borland compilers, and then went over to Microsoft and did C#.
So just out of curiosity, why do you rank education higher than experience?
Because education can save you from reinventing the flat tire, to use my phrase. And I should say it. I'd have to go back and look at the article. It has to be relevant education. You can. I have a good friend, Luke Homan, whose book, what's his book? Sociology, Software Engineering. I highly recommend. Who told me once he interviewed someone coming out of a 4-year program and the only language he'd ever programmed in was Java. What? And he said that terrified him. I said, yeah, it terrifies me too. This gets back to the coding C++ like Java. A good education trumps experience, or can trump, but if you have enough experience, then the education matters less. Yes?
In the context of this article, I read experience as experience in projects failing or the time of them being deadlines being slipped, some sort of that kind of experience on projects rather than experience in general, because experience can be an education in some.
It can, and I use the example of myself, and which is why it focused on the project management. But a lot of it is with experience. Is you learn what to do and what not to do. Now nowadays, a lot of unlike 25 years ago when we were doing pages, you can short circuit a lot of what you'd normally build by experience with Stack Overflow or whatever. How can I get this sample of working code that does X? And once you learn how to do that, then you start playing with it, varying it, and saying, okay, now what if I do this? What if I do this? I remember looking, particularly with Next Step and Objective-C, looking desperately for working code examples because there weren't a lot out there. How do you, here's this interface and here's this library, how do I use this object, how do I create it, how does it work? And I'd find code that worked and implement that and say, okay, I see that, now let me start playing around, changing parameters and seeing what the boundaries of this are. Short answer is don't get too tied up in the order here, simply put. Don't get concerned about, am I talented enough? Like I said, you wouldn't be seniors in the BYU computer science program if you were completely capable of working out in industry. I can go through and rank some things here, but I've known and worked with and hired people more talented than me. Yes?
About that, so you said we'll be working alongside a lot of people that frankly aren't as good as us.
Mm-hmm.
This might be too big of a question to answer in lecture, but what would be your advice for dealing with that and working with that effectively?
Be a mentor.
Be a mentor.
And which was a lot of what I've done as a consultant. Particularly, I spent 2 years at Fannie Mae, and we had several senior people in there, and our job was basically to mentor their in-house IT staff. We'd work with them, talk about software engineering, talk about quality assurance, talk about project management, and rather than do the work for them, our goal was to leave the organization better and more competent. However, the problem, and this is a great lead-in, the problem I saw at Fannie Mae was this. As the best IT people there got really good and started really honing their skills and becoming very effective at what they do, you know what they did? They left and became consultants because paid a lot more. And I watched this happen over a period of a couple of years at Fannie Mae, where their best engineers, their best programmers consistently left. And those who were left behind were those who weren't as likely to find a consulting job or find a new job. And this is a phrase I coined at the time. This is mid-90s. It was the Dead Sea effect. It's like, the Dead Sea in Israel, where all the fresh water evaporates. You're left with this salty, lifeless basin like we have up north in Salt Lake. This doesn't happen in all organizations. In fact, as I point out, some organizations are just the opposite. Some organizations tend to screen out the low performers and become better and better. But particularly in corporate and government IT groups, you will see this. And especially in government. That you have this influx of new people on a regular basis, and the ones that are really good, have really good opportunities, look around after a year or so and say, I'm not staying here. And they go find a better job somewhere, or sometimes simply a different job somewhere. If they're more senior, they realize, hey, I can hire myself out as a consultant and make double or triple my salary. And they go do that. People, I worked for years as a consultant at $250 an hour. And we're talking 20 years ago.
You have my undivided attention.
And it wasn't, this was in the late 90s, and it was because it was worth it to the companies to have me come in and review their projects and so on and so forth. Now, compared to what IT salaries were like in the late 90s, that was a pretty hefty markup. And the point is that if the organization isn't well run, the overall quality of the IT organization declines. It's very interesting. When I published this article on my blog, it got picked up by Slashdot, and
When was this?
2008. Got a lot of comments back, which I have now as an appendix in the article itself, so you can go back and reread the article, assuming you read it. Saying, no, this isn't true of all organizations. No, not everyone left behind is incompetent, so on and so forth. I got some interesting observations from other people in other engineering disciplines who said this happens in other engineering disciplines.
No kidding.
If it's a bad organization, the good engineers all leave. Whether it's mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, civil engineering, so on. And you end up with this increasingly entrenched, mediocre group. Yes?
So what's your solution to the Dead Sea?
Well, the solution to Dead Sea is you want to hire good people and encourage them to stay, and you want to try to avoid hiring mediocre people, and if you have them, encourage them to leave. You want to attract the best people. And a lot of organizations are not very good at that. A lot of the arguments I had at, Pages was a great experience. It was one of the highlights of my entire professional life. It was tough. I averaged 70 hours a week for the first 3.5 years. When we finally shipped, my reward to myself was I stopped coming in on weekends. And it was we had high hopes for Next Step, which were not well placed. There's a whole slew of companies that bet on Next Step, and it didn't work. Of course, and finally Apple bought them out, and Next Step became OS 10. But my goal was to keep the engineering team intact. And to that end, we had some very simple things. We didn't have massages and hot tubs or whatever, but we did have soft drinks and M&Ms in the kitchen. We had a standing rule that if 3 or more developers were staying past 7 o'clock, we had a folder full of local delivery food places. They could order dinner and the company would pay for them, and so on and so forth. And there were some times when, you know, because we were running on only a certain amount of money, this is one of the most valuable educations out of Pages was that every week as part of the senior staff, I'd be in a senior staff meeting, and our CFO, John Curry, would put down a spreadsheet which showed all our current expenses and our current money in the bank from investment. Basically said, here is the date we run out of money. We close our doors on this date if we don't either get more money or cut expenses. That was a priceless education into the realities of running a business. And John at times wanted to cut out things that I considered relatively minor, like the snacks in the kitchen. And I said, John, you're spending maybe a couple $100 a month on that. I said, if one engineer walks, we lose months. You know, to try and bring someone else in or have everyone else try to pick up the slack for losing one engineer. And most of those battles I won. We finally did have a layoff about a year before the company closed for good. And the company closed for good because we basically saturated the next step market, which was about 4 times smaller than we thought it was going to be. Started working to raise funds to move our technology over to Windows, and we had a drag and drop WYSIWYG web page editor at the end of 1994. You could drag components out on a page, press a button, and it would emit the HTML and all the graphics. And we took this to the venture capitalists who said, what's the web? Isn't Microsoft just going to do all this? So we closed our doors in mid-95. Four of the engineers went on and did their own startup with a greatly reduced and simplified version of what we had done, and sold themselves 2 years after that to Netscape for $24 million. So we missed the geek lottery by about 1 or 2 years. That's a lesson too. It's often all about timing. We will talk about, in fact, the next book you're going to read, Peopleware, is about mostly how to build a good organization or how to kill your organization.